This is the DRS train.
Ron gave up just at the end there. Yeah.
That's so good, so good.
Somehow I get the feeling we won't be hearing that on the podium anytime soon. I'm Peter Brook. I'm joined by the mobile Chicane, and you're listening to the DRS Train podcast. So Mexico City was a interesting race. Certainly, first 20 laps or so, more title drama between Lando and Max. But very good from Ferrari in the end. I'm kind of wondering at this point if we're almost on for a 2007, and maybe they can backdoor it a bit if Lando and Max are going to keep squabbling.
Constructors, 100%. I can see that coming on board. You know, I've wanted to be on board the Norris Championship hype train. I think we discussed on Twitter the other day that's turned into more of a replacement bus service. But yeah, I think Ferrari are catching McLaren hand over foot at the moment. You know, they're so competitive right now. I can fully see them taking the constructors, which I don't think any of us would have predicted beginning of the year, let alone any other time.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of constructors, Red Bull have finished. I think the last time the champion took the title and the constructors was third or lower was either 81 or 83. It definitely happened in 83 with Bradman and PK. 81.
Yeah, it was 83. Yeah, I looked it up the other day out of interest because I think there's only 14 times or so that the world champion has not been for the constructors champion.
Yeah.
So yeah, and 83 was the last time that Brabham finished third that year while PK won the championship. So
because 81 it was Hector Repiquet and Ricardo Zanino, I think, were the two, and they scored almost no points between them. And
that sounds correct. Yeah,
I can't remember who it was in 83. Maybe it was actually no, it was Petresi in 83.
I think it was Petresi, but obviously they had those very powerful BMW engines that wanted to also give out at a moment's notice. So I think that slightly hampered. By the way, I think PK still scored a ridiculous amount of pole positions that year, but yeah, it was the reliability that kind of dragged back that second car a bit as well.
Yeah, of course, Perez doesn't have that excuse. It's just him being useless. He can't blame the car for blowing up or anything. But yeah, we'll start with Ferrari actually because they finished first and third. Yeah, suddenly they've sorted themselves out, and for the first time in 15 years or so, they're looking kind of vaguely competent. Admittedly, one stops seem to work for them because I guess it limits the amount of like pit stops they can fuck up. But yeah, the moment the car is working, the drivers are being pretty solid. They're just a little bit too far behind. Leclerc, at least, is a little bit too far behind in the drivers, I think, to get there.
Yeah, well, sorry, one sec. I've always been a Ferrari fan, so it's wonderful to see them doing so well. Yeah, it's almost kind of, we've said that McLaren were almost a little bit too far back. They almost kind of started this championship challenge a little too late to make up any meaningful ground, and Ferrari, even more so in a way, it's only in the more recent races that they've become that consistently competitive force. We've seen, good glimpses throughout the year in Australia and Monaco and other places like that. But yeah, I think Leclerc is surely going to be gunning for second place in the championship. He's a lot closer to Lando than Lando is to Max. And yeah, they picked up, what was it? I think they picked up 55 points in the previous weekend in America, 40 odds this weekend, catching McLaren hand over foot. So it'll be interesting to see if they can keep up that momentum. Obviously, that's just two races, and all ifs and buts. If they can continue that momentum, then great, they will surpass McLaren. Let's see what happens because Ferrari, are not above making a fuck up at some point in time. So if they can keep being consistently competitive and getting the strategies right, all that sort of thing as well, then yeah, we're looking forward to like a first Ferrari title since 2008. I think they won the constructors that year.
Yeah.
So it's looking good.
Yeah, I mean it's just that I'm sort of Leclerc. There's been 3 bad races, but none of those were his fault. But the rest of it, he's been really, really consistent, and I'm surprised he's not more in this fight when you consider how erratic Lando has been. Because Leclerc, he's finished top 5 in every single race except Canada, where they just completely screwed up the strategy in the rain, and I think the car retired with brake problems anyway. Austria, he left too late in qualifying, had to start from the back and didn't make any progress. And then Silverstone, again, they fucked up in the rain with the strategy. None of those are down to driver error is the thing. And other than that, he's been very consistent. And really near the top. And Sainz has been a little more inconsistent. But then he had, he crashed at the end of Azerbaijan. He also retired in Canada, and he missed Saudi Arabia, which has put him a bit further behind. It just surprises me he's not closer in, because now looking at the top, it's Lando is 47 points behind Max, and Leclerc is 71 points behind. So literally per race, Lando needs to beat Max by 12 points, and Leclerc needs to beat him by 18. And that is short of Max having a retirement somewhere, that is a very, very tall order. I can see everyone wants there to be a title fight, but it's just not quite happening.
It's so close to being a title fight. It is tantalizingly close. It's at that point in time where we're balancing that fine edge between, over here is where it is not a championship fight, here is where it's a championship fight. We're kind of straddling this line in the middle where it is mathematically possible, and you can see scenarios where that can all kind of fall into place and where it can happen, but it's you're more holding on to belief than any kind of logic with that sort of thing. Like I say, we are kind of relying on a Max fuck up at some point, which reliability wise is hard to see happening. He was a little on edge this weekend, and clearly he's frustrated with the kind of drop off in competitiveness that the Red Bulls got. So when he's got that red mist about him, that leads to some mistakes and questionable decisions. So there potentially is where you can gain some points, but I can't see that happening every weekend until the end of the season, really.
Yeah, we'll get to it in a bit, but there is, I would say that there are some certain penalties which had whiffs of 2021 about them. I'll say that much. But yeah, I mean, Leclerc, Sainz got surprisingly far ahead, because at one point in the race, I was thinking maybe they should be considering team orders here. If they think, let's put this in Leclerc to go for the title if we want to help him out. But then by the point that I'd started thinking that, I thought, well, at this point, Sainz is almost 10 seconds ahead of Leclerc. Lando is catching him. They're not going to, even though it's Ferrari, they're still not going to bother with that, because had they done that, they could have risked Lando then winning the race. But it was just a very solid drive from both of them. I mean, qualifying as well, first and fourth in the end. Was it fourth or third? No, Lando was third. First and fourth.
Yep.
Yeah, I suppose these days it's just that even though the upgrades people are bringing are small, because the field spread is so small, it's making a lot of difference, and it's making weekends where some guys are amazing and others are just terrible. We had Mercedes for 2 races was suddenly unbeatable, and then almost overnight they went back to being 4th fastest and finishing like they did today, 30 seconds behind the podium finishers. It's a shame that it's all too little too late. Really, everything was determined in those first 5 races where we were just picking up where we left off in 2023.
Well, absolutely, 100% right. It was kind of, the stall was set then, and we've been lucky that we've been treated to at least sort of more tantalizing battles and different race winners and all that sort of stuff since then. I think the last time I was on here was probably about Miami or something like that, and I remember saying, if we're lucky, then maybe Norris might win a race and Ferrari might do, some okay things, but it's just going to be a Max procession. And obviously it's all completely changed, more or less, since that point in time.
Yeah. Max has now gone 10 races without a win, which is actually kind of insane.
Yeah, I think he is close to, and I'll go try and word this correctly, there is a record for most races not won in a season, in terms of you're taking all the races and you're seeing how many that the world champion did not win. I believe it's currently jointly held by, I want to say, Keke Rosberg in 82 and Vettel in 2012. I'm saying that tentatively for them ahead, which I think Max is presuming he doesn't win another race, will either equal or beat that. But yeah, he's been very fortunate. It's not the right word. He put down a strong marker early on, and he's been able to kind of comfortably hold on to that buffer throughout.
I mean, it's strong enough of a marker that the gap between him and Lando hasn't really changed. I think at Miami it was still around where it is now, roughly, or something like that.
It's ebbed and flowed, but there's been no substantial changes.
I'm just trying to think, because as a percentage of season wins, it's a fairly typical amount. I mean, six wins he's got out of 24. Is it 6 wins? That'd be 20. That's 25%. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 wins actually. So nearly 30% roughly is a lot. A lot of people have done that. But yeah, like you said, Vettel in 2012 got 4 wins, 6 wins, something like that out of 20 races. And then Keke, that was 1 win out of 16 races. So yeah, that's 10 in a row, and then Monaco, Miami, Australia. So 13 races he hasn't won this year. So yeah, if he doesn't win any more, he could break that record. If he doesn't, 17 non-wins in a year. But again, that's more just the effect of the longevity of this season. Now 24 races, when 10, 20 years ago, the season would have finished in Baku probably, and there'd be no talks of title discussions because Max would be like 70, 80 points ahead of everyone.
Yeah, I keep seeing these. You get all these like on this day kind of notifications on Twitter or something like that, and it'll be saying, "Oh yeah, the championship was wrapped up this time, 2007, 2008." I think it's mad that we're still going now. We've still got another 4 races to run on this season. Both of us working in more vintage and that classic F1 era as well. Sort of, you go back and you look through these seasons and reviewing all these Grand Prix, and it's only about remembering the days when they were just 15 or 16, and that seemed like a perfectly reasonable amount.
Yeah, I mean, the end of the season is still 6 weeks away, with 4 races to go.
Which is
and
nuts.
We have a triple header plus another 3-week break, having already had 2 4-week breaks. When it used to be that you had them basically a couple of double headers and then every other week, and then you had your 4 weeks off in August, and then I like 2006 after the summer break. I think there were only 3 races. It was Brazil, China, Japan, maybe Turkey. Not even Turkey. Monza. So yeah, 4 races, and now we've got 10 races after the summer break, with 2 other massive gaps in the middle. You can see how everyone's getting burnt out, and Max is one of the ones that complains a lot about how much travel they have to do and how it takes up almost your entire year, because you're going into a couple of weeks before Christmas, and then testing begins 2 months after that, and even before then they've got to be doing all the stuff at the factory, the car, and yeah, it is pretty exhausting. Yeah, good. Another very impressive day from Ferrari. Let's look at McLaren. So Lando, at first, when it looked, because in qualifying, Max had his first lap deleted, and we thought, okay, well, this is where Lando really needs to step up. And then even with Max only doing 1 lap, still qualifies behind him. The fight, this kind of treads into Red Bull as well. The fight was interesting. I mean, there's not much to say on Lando's part, to be honest. It's just that Max, it screams of desperation when he doesn't need it, because he can afford to let Lando beat him by 1 or 2 positions a race, and he'll still win by a massive margin. And he's not really thinking about the long game with that. But when we first saw the two of them, Lando was ahead braking for turn 4, but then they were kind of neck and neck at the apex. The second one, I thought he was trying to let him through because of the angle, and said it was just Max diving down the inside of him. Those kind of incidents, the thing is, they wouldn't happen if there wasn't so much runoff, or if the runoff was a bit less friendly to your tyres and your general speed. It's the track design, it really is just incentivizing people to drive like this more often.
Yeah. Are we McLaren or Red Bull chat now?
Let's make it McLaren, but the thing is, because it's hard for me to really comment on Lando on that incident, but
I've always been a McLaren fan, so I want to make sure I'm in the right space. Yeah, it's such a thorny issue to be tackling with these ongoing battles. And if we hadn't already had Austria, I said this is going to end badly at some point in time. Like you say, Max is very harsh on those kind of defending there, and like you say, he doesn't need to be, because he's the defender in this situation. In terms of the championship positions, he's the defender. Like you say, he can afford to let 2 or 3 points slither by on a weekend, because he's got that gap there. But Max is built as a machine who just wants to win. He wants to go out there every weekend and win every single race. You hear stories about last year where how disappointed he was about Singapore that the Red Bull wasn't good enough to win that race. It doesn't matter to him that Red Bull won, all other 21 races or whatever it was. He wants to be 100% all the time, always winning. So for someone built like that, it's got to be obviously greatly frustrating to see your team kind of slide back and not be in that position where he wants to be fighting for the wins, and he wants this to be, this equal battle. For him, it's not about, let's let 2 or 3 points slide by or something like that. He wants to be in front. He wants to be the man in charge of the whole situation. This is a tricky situation. We're two British guys sat here, and everyone's going to be talking about British bias or something like that. But I think we would be having the same conversation if roles were reversed, or if we were talking about Zhou Guanyu versus Franco Colapinto or something like that. I think Max is pushing the line of what is acceptable and what is fair in the same way that like a Schumacher used to do. And part of you has to kind of tip your hat and respect that he's recognizing that these are the rules, this is the black and white, and this is what he is working within. And we saw that last time out in Austin, where by the letter of the law, that move was perfectly acceptable because he was ahead at the apex and he was doing everything that he needs to do within those guidelines. He recognizes that, and he's playing the game correctly in that respect. From a sporting and traditional perspective, there's more of a blurred line there. You've got to think what is acceptable and what would, if me or you were in that position, what would we be doing, and would we be pushing so hard? You then get into conversations of, well, if you're not pushing so hard, then you're, allowing yourself to finish second in that position or something like that. So this weekend, though, it felt like he pushed a little too far when he didn't need to be pushing. If you want to look at what a kind of, I'm muddling over my words here. I suppose what I want to say is that, when we say that, he's pushing too hard, then there's going to be immediate pushback from people in the comments or other sources kind of saying, well, if you can't push like that, then how should you be pushing? If you're not allowed to do that, then what is racing? To that, I kind of want to say, well, look at what the Mercedes pair were doing later on in the race, where they were side by side and being hard but fair at the same time. And that's the kind of racing you want to be seeing. You don't want to be constantly in this position where people are being forced off the road or dive bombs going on, and then we then have to discussion of, was that correct? Was that not correct? To circle back to McLaren and all of that, there wasn't a lot that Lando could have done. He was trying to overtake, and you could see the way as they went into turn 4, and he was really trying to hold that outside, because he knew last weekend he'd lost out because he was behind at the apex. He's then trying to hold on more around the outside there, and I think even as they're just turning into the corner, I think he is a fraction ahead there as well. Before it then gets pushed off, like I say, then they cuts across the track. I would be very confused if I was Carlos Sainz in that position, because he was comfortably in the lead, and all of a sudden there's Lando Norris in front of him. Like you, I thought he was then going to shuffle back and then go, right, well, let's not get any kind of muddle, regardless of whether I think I'm in the wrong or the right. Let's jump behind Max again, and then we'll try again for it later on, which doesn't happen. And then, I think we got a bit of that kind of red mist Max that we don't see too much, but certainly when he was first starting out and when he was first in the Red Bull, and he was very attack focused and wanting to overtake and maybe a little bit more accident prone, and that kind of creeped up there. I think there was a lot of frustration that kind of leapt through at that point in time, which, he needed to keep his emotions in check. And I think if he'd settled down and not done that dive bomb, then we could have had more of a battle later on, or there would have been more overtakes and more going on there, rather than him just getting a slam dunk penalty and being shuffled back and kind of out of position.
Yeah, because I mean, Max's driving, it was a whole world of difference from Kota last week, where he was generally very measured and controlled in how he was defending from him, and just not so much this time. But with Lando and Max, I mean, I'm not too bothered who does or doesn't take the title. I mean, if Max does, it's like, well, okay, that's it's very good to still claim it with a car which is obviously not the fastest and hasn't been the fastest car for several races now, to get his 4th title, which is enormous. But that Lando is putting up a really, really poor effort in such a good car, and it would just feel very, I mean, there'd be the novelty of, we got a new champion and that if he does it, but then it's not been done in a very impressive fashion to be effectively marginally better than Damon Hill in 1995. That's kind of how it's looking at the moment.
Yeah, I think from a neutral's perspective, you always want to see a different name on there, and if you always want to see the underdog do it in a way, someone coming from behind and overtaking to win it. in terms of his performance this weekend, I guess you can argue, kind of maximised position he got there in terms of coming home in second and chipping, what was it, about 10 points or so out of Max's lead. I think a win was probably out of the question. I think Carlos Sainz kind of stamped his authority on the race and was just in another class. And on the days where he's like that, then, you just can't beat the drivers that are at the front like that, and they can happily kind of cruise away. We can get into that kind of battle where he had with Leclerc. I think he would have got past him had Leclerc not made that mistake. So I think second was on the cards. I suppose then the question is at what point he would have done it, whether he could have got the fastest lap point instead of Leclerc. But it's all ifs and buts. I think he did kind of as more or less as much as he could have done considering how good Sainz was today. But asking for that same scenario to repeat itself across the next 4 races, I think is going to be a stretch too far.
Yeah, I mean, that was almost a huge crash from Leclerc. I think even if Lando had caught him anyway, even if it was later, because the Mercedes was squabbling so much near the end, that gave Leclerc the buffer to just pit for fastest lap. Something, of course, that would have helped Lando would have been if he'd had a wingman in this race, which he just didn't, because Piastri, we saw another Q1 elimination. Admittedly, the first one was a sprint race, and sprint races don't matter. But yeah, track limits, again, it's circuit. The drivers are not the problem. It's almost always the circuit design that is the problem when it comes to track limits violations. But he didn't make particularly strong progress. And this is a track where you can, and in the past people have made a lot of progress because it has several overtaking spots. But he was getting caught in DRS trains for a while. It got to 8th, and I was thinking near the end, it's like, maybe if he really charges and gets past the Haas's, he could have a go at Max. But he was 20 seconds behind at that point. If he'd been in if he'd made it to Q3 and been at the front, let's say he finishes 4th. That pushes Max down to 7th. That's another 2 points for the land at 12 points. It's just below the threshold of what he actually needs. Because now the points average that Lando needs to catch him, it keeps going up after every race. Because I think in Baku it was about 8 points he needed, and now it's 13 points. So it just keeps slipping away. Of course, say if next week Lando wins and Max crashes or retires or whatever, that the lead has then dropped down to 22 points, 21 points with fastest lap, at which point you're like, okay, I think he could definitely do it. With 3 races left, he needs 6-7 points per race. That's a definite possibility.
Yeah, I think this time next week, take a look at the point standings, and then we can kind of conclusively say whether this won't they championship battle is on. Because if we get that huge point swing from a Max mistake, a Max retirement, and a Lando win with fastest lap, then absolutely let's have a conversation about it, because 21 points with 3 races to go, more than doable. If he's just chipped away another 5 points or so and we're sat on 42 points, not going to happen. Like, again, you're then relying on reliability issues, mistakes, and you would assume that the people of experience that are Red Bull and Max Verstappen as well will recognise that and go, well, we're not going to go pushing the engine to its absolute limits. We're going to make sure and double, triple check everything is going to be running at its correct capacity. Nothing's going to be pushed over the margins that it needs to be, and they can kind of just cruise away there. But yeah, I think let's see where it is next week. Like you say, it wasn't helped not having Oscar in the mix this weekend. I think it's always worth remembering, this is still only his second season. Talented as he is and how quickly he's kind of come to the front and become a race winner, it's easy to forget that he's still relatively inexperienced at this level, and it's a big ask to say to someone of that experience, we're expecting you to be a wingman in a championship challenge now. So he's still, I say, allowed to make mistakes. It's more forgiving in a way that he's still only in his second season and can have the occasional off day like this, whereas if it was like a Perez or something like that, then it is more kind of inexcusable. But yeah, even all that considering, it wasn't a fantastic effort from him. Again, stuck in those DRS trains, couldn't make up a lot of progress. But that kind of needs to be put a line under that, and then no more mistakes for the rest of the year. He needs to be back in that regular position of in and around that top 4 and getting those big points for McLaren. Because if he's making those mistakes again, then that's opening the door even more for Ferrari.
Yeah, I mean, he's at this point he's now 64 points behind Lando, which could be worse, I guess. I mean, he's only had one pointless race, which was Miami, although he did score in the sprint race. Yeah, beginning of the year, he was when the car wasn't so good. Those first 5 races, he was a fair bit behind Lando, and yeah, it's just been the odd race there, here and there, with the hasn't really. I mean, he was amazing in Baku, but since then has just kind of fallen off a bit. It does mean it has been quite damaging though in the constructors, because while they're 54 points ahead of Red Bull, they're 29 points ahead of Ferrari. And so this is where you're like, yeah, Ferrari definitely could catch them if they can maintain that level of form. But yeah, let's move to Red Bull properly. Initially, yeah, Max took second when in quali just off 1 lap. It was a very good effort. Also because he missed a lot of FP2 because of engine problems, and I think they were trying not to push it because this is a circuit which is quite hostile to engines because it's very hot, but also the high altitude and the thin air. It's very touch and go with how much power you're going to get, and also how much downforce you're going to get, because the downforce levels drop too. And I think they were probably doing whatever they could to avoid having to. That they put an old engine in, and so I think they were just doing whatever they could to avoid a grid penalty, because had he started at the back, his progress would have been. He maybe would have scraped into the points, but not very far into it. If you think how his general pace was not brilliant, and also how what Checo was like. But yeah, with the incident when he got the 10-second penalty, I thought that was for both of them, and then he gets another one. It's like, it's been a very, very long time since anyone's got a 20-second time penalty for anything. Because normally incidents like that, especially the first one, which is pretty minor, if anything, you would only get a 5-second one for that. But I'm kind of wondering why we almost never see drive-through penalties or stop and go penalties anymore. It's like, why not just do those, because those are fun.
First things first.
Have you got the entire grid?
I'll tell you, I've had to take some creative liberties when we get to some teams further down the grid. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Yeah, I feel like they have been kind of more rigorous with the penalty system. So yeah, we don't really see stop goes or drive-throughs anymore. I feel like they've kind of left those as last resorts for really bad kind of infractions. I'm not quite sure entirely what that is. Maybe immediately turning left when it's a right-hand corner and forcing someone off would warrant that. But yeah, 10 seconds was... I think I was the same as you. I was like, yeah, that makes sense. 2 tough incidents. You can argue that that's a 5-second certainly for the first one, and then the second one was, yeah, you could probably put that on there as well. It was very interesting to the one that then came out that actually, oh no, both of those warrant 2 separate penalties. I thought that was an interesting decision. It's, yeah, like you say, I mean, I'm trying to find the line of where I want to kind of pin the blame on that one. And it's, Max is not a guiltless party in this situation. It's because of his actions that those penalties came around. Did they need to be as severe as they were? Potentially not. You wonder if some of it is still kind of a fallout from the previous race as well, and that was kind of fresh in the minds of the stewards, which shouldn't be. At the end of the day, each race is its own only kind of capsule event, and you should be warranting and judging what people are doing at that weekend. But yeah, at the end of the day, he's the one that made the decisions to race as hard as that, and it was deemed that was kind of the correct penalty for it, which, yeah, essentially put an end to the race for him. But it will be interesting to see what happens where, Red Bull have not found a magic button to make it magically faster, so it's feasible that he's not going to win any of these kind of last 4 races. What's going to happen if more incidents like this keep happening? If Norris is able to get that big chunk of points down, what kind of decision-making process is Max going to be running through then? It's going to be really interesting to see, because he's never really been in a defending position before. He was more or less neck and neck / chasing Hamilton in 2021, and then I suppose 2022 he was behind Ferrari early on, but then that very quickly overturned within a few races, and last year we all know about. So it's a new position for him to be in, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Yeah, if a mistake does come around, or yeah, just some sort of retirement or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we very rarely see penalties like that. And another thing you kind of think about is that in the second one, okay, yes, he made both of them cut the corner, but then they both lost out to Leclerc. So that in itself can count as a penalty, is that they've ended up losing position off of it. Or in Lando's case, he lost 2 positions. But again, I mean, those corners, they're pretty fast corners. I mean, we saw crashes from Albon and George in that section. But there are ways of doing it that makes it less inviting to go on, because you can't. I mean, grass is not a good idea. Gravel, absolutely not. But yeah, I do. Aside from its seizure-inducing colours, I like the abrasive runoff they have at Paul Ricard, because it slows you down and it tears your tyres to shreds. So bye incentive to cut corners or push people off, or well, unless you can push them off and not yourself, I suppose that you could argue that. It's stuff like that, the large runoff, and also these enormous rumble strips, and then the cars are like boats because they're enormous and they're trying to get around these really. We saw, I mean, not just Lando and Max. We saw other people struggling to get through to turns 4 and 5, making moves on each other, because you just can't. You can't really fit these cars on circuits like that because they're just too wide. They're too long. The steering is heavy, and it means that we're constantly having these discussions now, because I think in Qatar they're actually meeting with the stewards to discuss what penalties are going to be like in terms of driving standards going forwards. There is all this discussion about what is and isn't a legal overtake, how you're supposed to do one, rules about moving in the braking zone, and it takes the organic nature out of it, and makes everything feel way too controlled and way too choreographed. Because, and this is something a lot of older drivers from the past complain about, is that they understand, okay, when it comes to blatantly cutting corners, you can't do that, but otherwise, just let them race and let them get a little bit argy-bargy if they have to, because it's just too controlled otherwise.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it should just be common sense. This is the reason that we started having ex-drivers on that stewarding panel, because then they could give that perspective of, right, I'm in that position, I'm in car A, I'm in car B, this is what I would doing, this is how I'd react, and you can judge accordingly whether it is the correct and sensible thing to be doing. If you're clearly forcing someone off the road, that's less correct. If you are making a valiant attempt but you couldn't turn to the left because there was another car there, or you clearly lost control of your car, so you didn't have an option but to run wide and force someone else wide as well, that should be all kind of put into consideration as well. I guess it's difficult because you have to run a letter of the law at some point in time. If you're making rules and regulations for any kind of sport or game or whatever sort of thing, there's a black and white. This is what acceptable. This is what is not acceptable in a way. And it's the same with like track limits or something like that. You need to stay within the white lines. Those are the limits of the track. If you go off the limits of the track, even if it feels like you've not gained an advantage or you're just a nanometer across, you've still gone across. That's the letter of the law, and that's where that kind of line needs to be put. It's unfortunate we're in a position now where so many of these tracks, like I say, have these enormous runoff areas where it's almost kind of an incentive to push those track limits away and gain as much of an advantage as you dare to without getting that kind of telling off from it as well. So I feel like I've gone on a tangent and forgotten what the original point was, but
yeah, it just felt. Yeah. I mean, as I said earlier, it just felt unnecessary from Max. That you need to think about the long game, because drivers like Hamilton and Vettel, they probably would have just let Lando take it, because okay, well, if we finish in the current positions, I'm only losing 3 points to him, and I'm X amount of points ahead. And Max doesn't seem to think like that. It seems to be like you said about Singapore last year, which, I mean, part of that, and maybe this is me, maybe it's an OCD thing of thinking we could be the first team this year to win every single race in the season. But he'd already lost the chance to win every race himself, because without the gearbox failure in Jeddah, he would have won that race. Baku, Checo was basically faster, but at the same time, Max got screwed over by the safety car, came just after he pitted, something like that. And just without these little things, he could have won every single race in the season, which we've never seen before. There are almost no racing series of any kind where that's happened before. So that would be just a huge moment. And I get, because I think he was frustrated because he'd taken the lead at the start and then lost it very quickly, and he was complaining about his battery settings, not having no power or using up all the juice or whatever. Because that was why Carlos made that huge dive, because he could see the light was on, that he's recharging the battery or whatever. And he was complaining about that, and Lando next lap takes the chance. So he was probably thought, I'm just going to keep going backwards. And it's like, yeah, but you do need to really think about controlling it, because we saw like thinking the long game, because even this is kind of what Rosberg was doing in 2016, because the last 4 races he finished second to Lewis, but he would have known in his head, okay, well, if I do the maths after Malaysia, what happened there, I can still win it even if he does all of this, so it's not a disaster if I don't get there. And these are all, because we're Mercedes, it's unlikely we'll be beaten by anybody else, so I can just sit there and take second. It's that kind of thing. And again, even like Nelson Piquet did the same thing. 1987, he only won like 2 races, but he was much more consistent than Mansell, who was very reckless and eventually injured himself and he got the title that way. It's this sort of thing that Max isn't doing. He's much more old school. It's just go as fast as you can and try and beat everyone all the time.
Max is an entirely different beast from so many other drivers we've had in the past. And I mean that as kind of the highest compliment as well. This is a man who, doesn't want to accept second or finishing behind his championship rival. He wants to win all the time. He wants to win every single race. And if not, he wants to win the next one and the one after that as well. I've mentioned this in other places, and I may have said this here before as well, but he's such a unique example of a driver who is content to just keep winning. You mentioned those names like Hamilton or Vettel or Schumacher in the past reach a point where they've said, right, that was good, but let's tackle another challenge now. Most of the time that means going to Ferrari or something like that. But it's normally a determination to go, right, well, I've proved myself by winning X amount of titles and X amount of races with this team. I now want to take that somewhere else and prove to everyone else and to myself that I can take on a project and build a team forward to the front. And Max is so unique, and having never really wanted to do that, I know there's been a lot of conversations about Mercedes this year, and in 25 and 26 as well, it's been mooted. I don't know how much credence I put in that sort of stuff. He's not, to my knowledge, made a lot of noises that he's interested in moving. I think he just wants to sit in the best car possible and always have the best opportunity to win. And when he can't do that anymore, he will step away, because he will have done everything he wants to, and he'll go off and win in Le Mans or any other kind of series that he wants to just be constantly at the front at, really. So it explains part of the way these frustrations he's had and some of the driving he's had, because he is built around winning. He just wants to win, and when he can't do that and he's having to settle for more conservative driving, it doesn't mesh well with his personality and what he's kind of built around and geared towards.
He's a psychiatrist's wet dream, really, because I think so much of this, you kind of feel like he'll only stop winning once he finally gets the approval from Jos, or finally gets a well done or a hug or something. There's a lot of that, because he's been primarily his tutelage has come from Jos, who himself was an old school argy-bargy, not particularly good racer. But they and other drivers have talked about when he was in karting and single seaters, how Jos was just really cruel to him whenever he didn't win anything. And we've heard the stories about abandoning him by the side of the road, and obviously that will affect you. And Max, he's so ingratiated in racing in a way that no other drivers are, because when he, I mean, we talk about when he's not racing, he's doing his sim racing and all of that. So he's just tackling everything constantly. He's like Alonso in that respect, because Alonso doesn't do anything else, because he does. Because he's a bachelor and everything, but he has his karting. He has karting stuff and his own little. He coaches a bunch of drivers and all of that. So again, he's one of these people that's just focused on racing. Whereas the people like Hamilton and Vettel, when it comes to racing, both of them were extremely determined and committed people. But Vettel eventually quit, and now he wants to save the world. And Hamilton wants to save the world by wearing some interesting dresses on red carpets and all of that. But they have priorities outside of Formula One, and Max doesn't have that. Admittedly, he's relatively young. He sort of has a family in that he's with Kelly. He's a surrogate father to Penelope. I don't know what the situation is like between him and Kvyat. I'm sure that's quite interesting. And he's a cat dad, so he's got a couple of things. but he just his mentality is different because all the other drivers have other hobbies and he doesn't have that.
Would you say that there is another driver in the Red Bull camp who maybe needs to start looking at some hobbies away from the racetrack potentially by next year?
Well, maybe he should start looking at those hobbies today, I think.
Yes.
We've even seen, so I mean, for once, Christian Horner has stated that he may not even last the year. He's given a very vague statement because, I mean, Helmut Marko has turned into this sort of random AI generator type thing. He just says whatever comes into his mind. And he's like, oh, we are assessing them. Because it was just funny with Checo that he gets the extension, and then like a week later, they're like, oh, we'll discuss it over the summer if we're keeping him. And then they do keep him, and it's like, oh, well, he might not stay until next year. And now it's become he might just go already. And maybe they'll throw in Lawson or, God forbid, bring Netflix back. I don't know. He's over 200 points behind Max. If I talked about the 60 point gap between Oscar and Lando, Max has got more than double his points. And last year, he finished the season with more than double Checo's points, and Checo was still the runner-up. But God, even for his home race, just 100 times worse than even last year. Because last year, everyone was like, oh, well, at least you tried. It's like, but he crashed at the first corner, and he was the only person to crash at the first corner in his home race. When have you ever seen Lewis crash at Silverstone? Unless you count 2021, I don't think he's ever crashed there. Certainly not in a race. He's ever binned it in any. I mean, 2009 was a train wreck, but all his other races.
That was the 2009 McLaren, which was just a train wreck throughout most of that first half. So
until a week ago, that was his worst ever race, and I think we can comfortably say it was Kota now. And the same. I mean, okay, Vettel has a terrible record in Germany, but you know what I mean. Max again, even in Zandvoort, is good. But he gets knocked out in Q1 again. Okay, Piastri being there makes it look slightly less awkward, I suppose, but then Piastri is a much more inexperienced driver than Checo. And we thought, ooh, he's up to 13th. Oh, guess what? He started like halfway across the border into America in his grid spot. He was so far ahead. Like, I mean, I know that from that where they're sat, you can't see it. But the thing is, the start line was literally behind his front wheels. Like, that was huge. And he was like, oh, well, I thought it was a good start. And then he had like Max, he was being very scrappy turns 4 and 5 because Stroll had to cut the corner trying to pass him there. He had some stuff going on. Then him and Liam Lawson had some contact, and then Liam Lawson gave him the middle finger, passing him later in the race. And okay, he had damage. And then he pitted. Even after Max took his 20-second penalty, he still came out ahead of him. He spent a lot of the race fighting with Zhou Guan Yu, which, to be honest, happens more often than it should. Just really nothing to take from that at all. It's been another awful season for him.
The whole situation is indicative of a Red Bull outfit who had a plan in place that has not happened, and now they're kind of flailing and panicking around as to how we try and fix this situation. Because I think in their minds, they were thinking, right, Perez has struggled towards the end of 2023. We'll give him some time in 2024 to prove himself. But we've also got Mr. Ricciardo still knocking around. So we'll put him back in the V-carb. He'll be as amazing as he was in Mexico last year. So then it'll be a no-brainer for him to get the re-promotion back into Red Bull. It makes sense from a PR perspective and a sporting perspective that way. And then we can see what we want to do with Perez. And then none of that happened. You know, it almost came about. You know, Perez kind of held up his end of the bargain in terms of struggling, but Ricciardo just wasn't able to have that extra step that he used to and showcase that flash of speed to kind of his detriment and in the end, you know, the end of his career. But now it feels like they generally just don't know what to do with that car because they've, like you say, there's been such a complicated situation with Perez all year in terms of, oh, here's an extension to your contract. Oh, well, actually, we might get rid of you. Oh, no, but we will keep you because you've got some of your better circuits coming around and, you know, we'll change around engineers and specs and I think he moved back, sort of dialed back on a few kind of upgrades with the car to make it more comfortable again. And now we've gone back to this kind of hard-hitting, oh, well, he might not be in there next year, or he might not even be in by the next race. You know, it's indicative of a management system that wants to see improvement from their kind of employee, but has genuinely no idea how to do that, because it feels like they've tried being good cop and they've tried being bad cop, and both ways have failed to kind of generate that kind of extra step and performance that Sergio was capable of in the past. We've cycled back 18 months or so more. We were having a discussion of, oh, well, maybe Sergio could actually win the championship in 2023 because he'd had such a good start to the year. He was being consistent where Max wasn't. And, it would have been very much an uphill battle in what was Max's team, but he was looking strong. And then it's all just kind of gradually fallen apart from there. You've got the situation at RB, which has been shuffled around all the time. They don't know what they're doing with that position. We've now got talks that Sonoda, who's long been not touted for the seat, they didn't want him anywhere near it, is now actually going to test the Red Bull at the end of the year. You've still got Lawson's name kind of being bandied around. They'll probably check in Hadjar and Arvind Lindblad at some point in time just to try and get something going. But it is such a mess. And it's such a shame because Sergio, when he's good, has been really good. When he was at Force India, he was kind of quite often best of the rest, a very solid midfield performer. And if there is a position opening up in 25 or 26 in that midfield, I think any of those kind of midfield operations would be mad not to try and look at signing him, regardless of the struggles he's had at Red Bull. We know what he can do when he's in that midfield operation and can make, tyre strategies and racecraft work to his benefit there. So it's such a shame to see how much it's kind of tailed off here. And, this weekend really was indicative of someone who was just trying too hard, not only to keep his seat, but also to, impress in Mexico. He would desperately love to get that win at home. And it's just, well, it didn't happen this year. And then realistically, it's not going to happen any other year if he gets the drop from here. So, yeah, I don't know what Red Bull needs to do. I don't know what he needs to do, but it just feels like it's just not going to happen. It's not going to work. It's hard to see a solution where suddenly Checo sparks back into life again.
Yeah, I mean, as a driver, he's never really bothered me that much. He's just always been there. But the thing is that he and Hülkenberg were teammates for a long time, but Hülkenberg has had this huge glow up in the past couple of years and really improved his form. When he used to be, of the two, Checo was often the stronger one when they were at Force India. And yeah, at that time he was very good in the midfield because he would get the occasional podium here and there. With Sauber, nearly won a couple of races, amazing tyre whisperer. He's not even a tyre whisperer anymore. He's lost all of that since coming to Red Bull. And this year, we get to, because they say, oh, we'll keep it because we've got your good circuits coming up. And it's like, for any good driver, every driver should be their good circuits. And we get to Baku, where historically he has been very good. It's the one race where he's on course to beat Max, and then he crashes at the last lap and still gets beaten by him. And it's the fact that they were willing to eventually let go of Ricciardo. It stuns me that he's still here. Maybe that's Laurent Mekies in VCARB having more swing in driver decisions, even though at the last word it really comes down to Marco. But also the fact that Christian is just constantly defending him. It's like, yeah, I think you're just trying to keep some secrets still secrets, because at the beginning of the year, when nothing was happening on track, everyone was just obsessed with the Horny Horner scandal, and then that disappeared almost overnight, and we pretended it never happened. And I'm sure that Max and everyone, I mean, I don't think Max cares. I'm sure he knows everything, but I don't think he cares at all. I'm sure Checo knows, but the team is a sinking ship because they've lost Jonathan Wheatley and Adrian Newey and other people. And it's obvious that next year, no matter who their drivers are, it's not going to be a very good car. The title next year is more than likely going to be between Ferrari and McLaren. And Checo is really jeopardizing it because they could still, with any other driver, they could still be fighting for the constructors' title, but it's slipping further and further away now.
I've said in other places I was astonished that he kind of, with all that conversation that had over the summer break that he was going to be dropped, that he wasn't dropped, because if they kept him, I was saying, they're guaranteed to lose the constructors the way the momentum is going. If they chucked in a Lawson or a Ricciardo, whatever they wanted to do, they might not have lost the constructors. I think it's still a big ask given kind of how much McLaren and Ferrari have improved, but I think it would have been a lot closer than it is now, whereas Sergio was just kind of meandering through the end of the year, and yeah, he's not contributing to the constructors, let alone being any kind of assistance to the Drivers' Championship as well.
It's just frustrating, but it's so obvious that when you see what the attendance is like in Mexico and the reception he gets, even with him driving like shit, is that the marketing aspect does play a part in it. So something that did happen, though, of course, is that because this weekend we had 5 different rookies driving in FP1 for different teams. So there was Pato O'Ward for McLaren, Kimi Antonelli for Mercedes, Robert Schwartzman for Sauber, Ollie Behrman for Ferrari, and then
Djokovic was at Aston Martin.
Drogovic, yeah. And afterwards, I mean, again, Pato is just a marketing machine, immensely popular. He was seen chatting to Christian, and I was thinking, I mean, I'm game. If they want to replace one Mexican with another, why not have him in there? I mean, the marketing would be even bigger if he did it. I mean, I'm sure he's very happy in IndyCar, but he keeps doing these McLaren tests and he's part of their team. So I'm sure he wants to go to F1 if there's a window, but with McLaren there isn't, because they would probably put someone like, even if Oscar or whoever was going to leave, they'd probably put think about Bortoletto beforehand. That being said, there has been, apparently Mark Webber has been chatting with Christian about trying to get Oscar in at Red Bull. Which again, that could be fun. If they think that McLaren is a dead end, then it's just going to become Lando's team. Why not try that? I mean, he's not going to beat Max, and the car's not going to be good, but it's just something to do. But yeah, Pato or Oscar, a darn sight better than Checo.
Yeah, there's every chance that come 2025, like you said, McLaren are going to be in that title hunt, and there's every chance that kind of relationship is going to implode there. We kind of got a sneak peek of it in Hungary with the whole team orders kind of thing. So imagine that across the entire stretch of a year, where maybe if McLaren are the class of the field and no one is touching them, and it's a battle between the two of them, you know, what happens there, and who gets preferential treatment, and how do they kind of handle that situation? Because McLaren have not really had that kind of. Yes, they had Button and Hamilton there, but McLaren weren't consistently at the front in perhaps the same way they were in like 2007 with Hamilton and Alonso. So, yeah, I could see why one of them would potentially want to be moving towards the exit if that situation does emerge. And then it would be a very interesting kind of discussion as actually who would go in there, because you could be sure plenty of drivers are going to be wanting to be rigging up at Woking and getting into what's becoming a more and more competitive seat. As the years goes on. I mean, again, you know, talk about an IndyCar driver coming to Formula One. That's my kind of wet dream. You know, that's just more content for my channel coming up in the future. It would be interesting to see, and I did think for a while that O'Ward or even Palau were potentially being groomed towards that eventuality, but it seems like, other than just sort of a few token appearances just for the sake of free practice and sponsorship exposure, nothing's necessarily going to come of that. It would be interesting to see what O'Ward could do if he was given a full-time opportunity. And it would be even more interesting to see what would happen if a Piastri stepped into the lion's den that was Verstappen's team, especially if we're considering that Max may not want to stick around towards the end of 2028, as he's kind of subtly hinted at, especially if Red Bull kind of drop off competitiveness as well. You know, that's potentially room for Oscar to make that his own team, given that there's no real kind of standout candidates from that Red Bull Junior lineup to step up and be that new Vettel / Verstappen kind of role.
Yeah, I mean, Max has said in the past, like, I won't be here in 2030. So we know we have that much. But if he wanted to, because we've seen the longevity that Alonso has, he could easily stay for another 15, 16 years. He could be here until 2040 and have done a full 25 years in Formula One, by which point he'd have, how much would that be? Over 500, probably close to 500 race starts, or even more, something obscene like that. And yeah, I mean, in the past, you know, drivers that have come from Indy to Formula One, things didn't necessarily go as well as they would have hoped, but they were nothing if not entertaining, which is really what matters the most. So yeah, okay, let's look at Mercedes. Interesting weekend. So yeah, Kimi Antonelli takes Lewis's seat in FP1, doesn't crash this time. George, however, did crash in FP2. That was a very big shunt. He was limping afterwards, and people wondered, will they throw Antonelli in now to replace him? He did race. It just meant that he didn't have the he was running the Silverstone spec or the Miami spec, I think, as he basically destroyed the new upgrade. So Lewis had the new upgrades. They were kind of in their own thing, because the car is clearly not fast enough to match the other three teams, even though, you know, Red Bull, it's hard to gauge where their pace really was this weekend. And they spent most of the race battling each other, and yeah, just a good demonstration of clean racing. Although Hamilton, there was one point where Hamilton had a very close call with somebody. I think it was Colapinto or someone.
I think it was when they were coming up. You had that train of Lawson, Piastri, and Hamilton there, and Hamilton was obviously a big old DRS train, and he did seem to get just a bit kind of close to Piastri. Then was comfortable, but not quite.
There was nearly a big accident there, but otherwise, yeah, those two were just battling each other. Hamilton eventually won out, but yeah, they've gone from 2 months ago having the best car, and everyone's like, well, they could win every race now. To even though, to be honest, when you look at the wins they got this year, Russell only won in Austria because Max and Lando crashed into each other. Silverstone, McLaren did everything in their power to make sure that they couldn't win that race, and George had had the engine failure, and then the penalty, the disqualification for George in Spa. But yeah, since then they've just been kind of miles off really, and it's gonna be that way. Next year, we'll see. Without Lewis's influence, the image of the team will change quite a lot. But there were points where people were thinking, is Lewis going to regret this when he won those 2 races? Like at this point, it's obvious that Ferrari are doing extremely well, so I don't think he is.
Yeah. Oh, wait.
That's about 2010 spec. That one looks.
Yeah, it also got Rosberg on it. That's how old it is.
Oh. Nice.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, back to kind of the usual schedule program we've seen from Mercedes at other points this year, where better than everyone else in the midfield, but not able to kind of touch those other 3. It was good to see them battling kind of hard and fair on track. You don't often get to see that. Often team orders can potentially come into play, or I thought there was every chance at one point that they'd let one by, but then pit the other for the fastest lap. But given they had such a buffer to Max, I think it was only about 10 seconds at one point, it was nice that they could kind of freely fight without anyone kind of having to come on the radio and say, let this person pass or hold position or anything like that. So it was good to see some hard and fair racing between the two. Good for Antonelli to actually make it through an entire free practice session. At the end of the day, I think it was still... you see it talked about, IndyCar drivers coming in. It was the same for kind of Antonelli coming in, and yet while he crashed within 1.5 laps of racing, those are still probably the most over-analysed 1.5 laps in a practice session that we may ever kind of see, and potentially some of the most exciting kind of data that we've extracted from it as well, in terms of how he was taking his corner entries and stuff like that. But it's so hard to judge. I mean, I've moaned in the past about kind of how relatively pointless these young driver sessions are in terms of gauging what kind of performance they're running at, because they run through their own kind of programs in the team. So whilst the teams get a sense of where their performance levels are at, it's hard for us to kind of gauge from that as well. It would be nice for them to be getting some low fuel runs or something like that, and seeing who could set a decent lap time with that under consideration. But you understand why not, because you could have an Antonelli and Monza where he bins it within 1.5 laps, and that affects the rest of the setup for the weekend. So it would be nice to find ways around that. If we could bring back third cars, would be nice to see again, just for practice appearances, so they can get a proper sense of extracting as much performance as they can. We've had that talks of the young drivers race, which not happening this year, but it looks like it will happen next year, which will be interesting to see. I hope we get a full grid for it. I think a 10-car race would be a little bit naff, a bit too much USA 2005. But if we could find a way to get all 20 cars on the grid with young drivers or something of that ilk, we could properly gauge and get a sense of what these guys are doing, because I think everyone's of an agreement that something like F2 or the Junior Series, we're not really getting a fair gauge of how good these drivers are and how well they can perform. So, but yeah, quite quietly consistent from Antonelli, got onto the job. We can only assume that he ticked all the boxes that Mercedes wanted him to do. And then, for the other guys, a standard weekend, nothing too much to shout about. They were nowhere near kind of a conversation for a podium or a win, but we're always going to kind of be safely in the top end of the points.
Yeah, when they said that they were going to do this juniors race, the rookie race, and then they cancelled it, I thought that it was going to happen during the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix weekend. But then I think it was actually meant to be as a replacement for the young drivers test.
So I believe they were going to. So at that end of season test, I think it would have been broken down the weekend. So there would have been tyre testing, and then there would have been a sprint-esque qualifying, and then more testing, and then the race would kind of wrap up the whole kind of event itself. But I believe, obviously, there are a lot of logistics around that in terms of what are how do you control the cost of that? What happens if a driver crashes? And making sure that everyone's in the right place at the right time. It was a little bit last minute. If you wanted to do it properly, it was quite a last minute kind of thing. But yeah, hopefully we get to see it next year, because it would be nice to have some of those races where, like we used to have the Race of Champions back a long time ago. We're talking like the 70s. It'd be good to see everyone in different kind of machinery or different kind of drivers coming to the front and getting a sense of where they're at and what they can perform in.
I mean, this is the thing about the discussion.
Yeah.
Discussions in the past about having like non-championship races. I think what would be a very good idea is if the sprint races were replaced with rookie races. So half a dozen weekends a year. Yeah, there is the rookies have their own race and they bring a third car, so they don't need to worry about totaling someone else's car. That'll be a very good solution, and it's its own separate like mini championship. That would be really fun. And even in the part we had the Nürburgring Race of Champions when they all drove those Mercs. Do something like that before the season's begun. Just put them all in the same car. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of them are probably like, I don't know if I want to be compared equally with everybody necessarily, but it's like it's just a fun experiment. Like do just stuff like this, and it doesn't need to be excessively complicated or expensive or whatever. These are quite simple things to do. Failing that, just bring back Friday drivers. Because at the moment, we're seeing there's 2 weekends a year they have to put a rookie in. They always do it right at the end of the season because they clearly don't care. They don't need their input or their data. They just do it because they have to. So they throw them in right at the end. Maybe just do the Friday drives, because the lack of in-season testing is that they do these weekends. They do the odd weekend using an old car, which is often obsolete, and then if they get a seat, they do pre-season testing, and that's it. And it's just not enough, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, it's making a step in the right direction, given that it's going up to 4 weekends from next year. So we'll see a little bit more, and they won't have that option to just lump them all in at the end. Again, that's what happened. What was it last year in Abu Dhabi? We had about 10, 11 different young drivers just to tick off that final.
One per quarter, because then they're spread out evenly, something like that.
Yeah, you could easily mandate it like that. There's no reason not to. I would love to see third cars come back. I understand why you can't from a cost perspective, but it's a great avenue, not just for young drivers, but for also those that aren't necessarily able. There's only 20 cars on the grid, so you can't fit everyone on there who deserves to be on there. And I think back to when we had third cars, and you would routinely have the likes of, you would have like Kubicas and Vettels kind of tearing it around and showcasing what they could do and kind of work their way into drives. But then you also had, Alex Wertz's and Anthony Davidson's in a way, who were more experienced heads, but could kind of showcase what their potential was and work their way back into a seat. So, whereas now you're kind of trying to have to gauge off F2, which is an impossible feat in terms of judging what the talent levels are there, or, just going off simulator work or something like that as well. So, yeah, we've steered away from what Antonelli did this weekend, but yeah, it would be good to see the likes of him and other young drivers given a proper shake of the stick to showcase what they can do, rather than just a vague program of some sort.
So let's go to now moving on to best of the rest. So Haas, they've improved dramatically in the past few in the past few races. I mean, this was even from K-Mag suddenly getting into Q3 and out qualifying Hülkenberg and then beating him very convincingly in the race. I mean, in the first stint, he was trailing the Mercedes. He was in their DRS range for 10, 15 laps or whatever. And I was like, where did this come from? Where has this been for, the past 3 years at this point? Like, it's just, suddenly improved. I mean, the team is running far better. I mean, getting rid of Gunter is the best decision they've ever made, because it's improved significantly. The drivers are doing really well off of it. The team morale is good. They're not having any of these train wreck sponsorship deals anymore. Very, very impressive. And they got 8 points at the end, which for them is very valuable.
Yeah, I mean, it's the first time they've. Oh, sorry. I'll say I'm not only a Haas fan, but I'm a fan of teams that have had both Kevin Magnussen and Nico Hülkenberg driving for them. I was very disappointed to find I didn't have a Haas hat this morning. To play devil's advocate, I think Haas are obviously performing very well for what is the smallest team in Formula One at the moment with the resource that they have. Yes, they've kind of tapped into that Toyota Gazoo partnership recently, but that's going to be a little while till we see kind of the benefits of that coming to fruition. But what they are doing is they are performing, they're doing everything they should be doing. They're ticking all the boxes, whilst others have kind of, we maybe expected to be ahead of them, have floundered a bit more. Sauber are being Sauber. Williams have made a car that's more consistent rather than peaky, but that's kind of shuffled back their performance as well. Alpine has just Alpined as well, and RB as well have kind of looked very promising early on, but shuffled back as well. So there's a reason that Haas are kind of shuffled in front of all of those other cars because they aren't performing as they should be. But at the end of the day, you have to tip your hat to Haas and say they're doing the job that they should be doing. This is the best kind of point streak they've been on since around 2017, 2018, whenever they were kind of running around fifth in the constructors. So, reflecting on this weekend, it's almost a shame that both those guys are moving on for next year, because Hulkenberg has been really, really, really good this year. I've been really impressed with Hulkenberg in terms of his sheer consistency. He's been regularly in the points, but also he's been like 11th, like 7 times or something like that as well. And Magnussen, yes, has been Magnussen around and been a little bit hard on the nose, and we obviously lost him for one weekend. But he's still showing that at this level, if he's got the car, he can perform and score points. I'm excited for Behrman next year. There's question marks over how Ocon's going to be in that situation, but Haas are making steps in the right directions. It was another really, really good weekend for them, and it's hard not to see them continuing to kind of pick up those points as the year goes on.
Does Magnussen have a seat next year? I can't remember.
He does not. No.
Okay. Well,
it seems unlikely.
I mean, I'm not bothered, to be honest. This will be the third time he's had to leave the grid. But if they keep this format for the last 4 races, then they could be knocking on Aston Martin's doorstep, because they're now 40 points behind them. And it's like, to be fair, get you both in Q3, both in the points each race. If Aston Martin continues to flounder, they'd be very, very lucky. They would need a race where front runners retire to get a lot of points at once. But 10 points per race, that could be enough, and they could just catch them. So quite the surge at the end. And also because this is a track which has often been really, really weak for them. They really struggled here in 2018 and again in 2019. They just didn't. In 2019, it was tracks that had long straights that they didn't like, because that was when the tyres would cool down and they couldn't get the temperatures up again. 2018, it was just the engine did not enjoy the high altitude and they were getting no power out of it, even though other than that, they were battling with Renault basically for best of the rest. But good for them. I mean, the Toyota deal, again, American team taking on this major technical partnership with a Japanese giant. Which is probably going to end up becoming Toyota engines. It's not an American team. Who's after that? Alpine. Ocon screws up Q1, starts from the pit lane, does nothing. Gasly makes it to Q3, finishes 10th. Yeah, they've been extremely invisible for the past few races.
Yeah, they've disappeared. I know I could keep the same hat on, but I'm going to change my hat.
Going back a bit further.
More vintage.
I do need some mild 7 merch, like the vintage Renault stuff and Benetton.
I used to love that kind of stuff. They've kind of disappeared off an edge. What can you say about Alpine? Really, they are kind of cruising. They are meandering towards another Renault exit. How often have we seen Renault kind of jump in and out of Formula One, and it feels like we're kind of nearing another pull out of it. I think the end of the engine production is kind of the start of it. It feels like Briatore is there to facilitate some sort of sail on, and I think the fact that Oliver Oakes and Hitech are in there now is very interesting, and I can absolutely foresee a future where that team becomes Hitech. You would hope that an Andretti is sniffing around, if not that outfit, then at least their place on the grids. They just seem wholly kind of disinterested and with no real clue as to kind of how to move forward. You would hope they would look at like a model like McLaren, which has worked its way from the back to the midfield to the front runners now, and given that it's a full works outfit, they could replicate that in some way, but it's just meh.
Yeah, I mean, it seems if nothing else, for next year they'll probably become Alsades. This Mercedes deal's like, yeah, classic French team getting conquered by the Germans again. But the high tech thing, maybe that could happen. I mean, that sounds more like an Oliver Oakes plan than a Flavio Briatore plan. I'm still trying to work out what he's thinking up. He still has his like revenge streak to go on. I think coming back after 16 years. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, well, at least if they become high tech, we can stop pretending they're a French team as well. Being based in Britain, most of the staff are British. Yeah, the drivers are French, but it's just no. They're just not very interesting, and they started the season really, really badly. They picked up very quickly. Mid-season, they got really good, and now they're just rubbish again, and just being really, really, really boring. And next year is Gasly and Doohan. So yeah, I mean, again, Gasly is another meh driver. I mean, we saw him get shafted by Max, and yeah, did very well against Yuki, but then as we'll get onto in a bit, it's Yuki. And Doohan is, we'll see. I mean, I'm happy to see him there, just in the interest of maintaining the continuity that the reserve driver is the one that should take over and get the seat eventually, even if he's not this, like, people don't consider him to be this massive superstar. That's how it used to be done. And he can have his year, and if he sucks, then they get rid of him and try someone else.
Yeah, there's nothing to lose for Doohan. If anything, he may end up being sort of a placeholder for that year whilst they figure out whether the team ownership's going to change around. And if he proves himself, then it's almost kind of like a Colapinto situation in a way, in that he may only get that 1 year that maybe his one only chance. So if he can shine with it and showcase himself, then he'll put himself in the shop window to either stay there or move elsewhere. But at the end of the day, he's getting at least a season in Formula One, which most other juniors couldn't hope for. And for a long time, you would have thought that that boat had kindly sailed on by for him. So yeah, I mean, best of luck for him. We'll see what happens. But yeah, I'm not sparked by any kind of confidence that Alpine is going to be in any kind of decent kind of conversation next year, other than, are they going to be sold? Are they going to pull out, sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, he'll probably join the long list of drivers that have done 1 year and then just left and didn't do much, or maybe 2 years if they're lucky. But it all depends on the future of the team, because things there are very unstable with them. Another team that's kind of down in the dumps at the moment is Aston Martin. They tried like 3 or 4 different upgrades/downgrades this weekend. None of them worked, unless a downgrade working counts as working. They brought on, I think they tried to bring back the Miami spec or from Spain or something, and it was like, it just doesn't work. And the new upgrades didn't work. So they always find themselves in this trap of nothing works, and they start the season reasonably strongly, and then everything just collapses at the end, and Alonso loses the will to live and all of that. I mean, now he's had it was his 400th race, and he retired from it, and then he retired from his 200th and 300th races as well.
I don't know that. Yeah.
I don't remember what his 100th race would have been, but that was probably during one of his title-winning years. And Lance, yeah, we saw he got a little bit scrappy with Checo. Again, why is Checo fighting an Aston Martin? But now, yeah, it's just a case of waiting for Adrian Newey to show up, although his influence is going to take a couple of years to settle in. And by then, maybe Alonso, even though everyone's thinking 33 is going to come, /32, that it might just be too late for him if he's pushing, 45, 46, and they finally get a good car.
I've lost my hat. Where is it? I had a Force India hat, but I've lost it, so I'll just have to deal with the green hat for now.
Yeah, the green, that'll do.
The green will work. Yeah, I mean, it's Aston Martin. It's become a point of time where it's more interesting to talk about what's going on off track than what's happened on track. I mean, it was a fairly non-eventful race. I mean, yeah, it's a great achievement to reach 400 races. I know that's quite an easy thing to do in this modern era where we've got about 50 races a year, but I still remember being in an era where Riccardo Patrese 256 starts was just kind of the pinnacle of it. And it was thought, it'd be silly for anyone to get past that. And now we're having a conversation with someone is just hit 400 races. Was it 20 21, 22 seasons or something silly like that, with more still to come and still a hunger to keep on doing it. So, it's a very impressive effort, and the fact that he's still able to kind of compete at that high level. He doesn't have the car beneath him this year in the way he did last year, but again, you just got to circle back to last year and the beginning of it to see that he's still very talented and still got the potential to do really well and get those podiums. It'd be great to see one more win, but we'll hold out hope for that. It all seems to be really kind of geared towards 2026 now. With Newey coming in, with Honda coming in, the next most kind of interesting thing that's going to come out of Aston Martin is what they do on the driver's front, because they've poached the best designer, they've poached an exclusive engine deal. It's now a case of who you're going to put behind that car, and it's going to be really interesting to see who they're going to go after and who they want to approach, because with the greatest will in the world, an eventually 50-year-old Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll are not going to be the right choices to lead an outfit like that to a world championship. So it's a question of money is no object. So who is it they're going to look at to try and poach from somewhere else, or kind of move towards that kind of project? I know I said that Max hasn't been interested in that, but it would be interesting to see whether they could entice him with sort of saying, we've got Newey, we've got Honda, how well that kind of combination has gone together in the past, whether that's something you would like to participate in, or do they go for Leclerc or a Russell or a Piastri or Norris or just something like that? That's going to be the next really interesting chess piece move from Aston Martin.
Yeah, in a couple of years, those seats are going to become very valuable, I think. But at the moment, it is just a dead end because they have a couple of juniors. They got Drogovic, who did FP1 for them this weekend, who otherwise has been largely ignored and is going to be another one of those failures of the Formula 2 GP2 pipeline. And Jack Crawford, I mean, at COTA, they started some new sponsorship deal or branding thing with Crawford. Maybe it was only for that weekend because he's American. But for them, it's nowhere to go at the moment because I'm sure they're waiting for Alonso to decide to eventually retire. But even then, they probably would take someone with more experience, because Stroll, it's really hard to tell with Stroll if he's just going to stay there forever or if he doesn't actually care enough and he will eventually quit, or his dad will pull the support or the funding or convince him to go to the WEC division instead. It just makes it a frustrating situation, because we saw a bit of action from him in this race, just scrappy, but he's just so profoundly uninteresting, and it's like he's not even trying a lot of the time, whereas Alonso is giving 100% and getting very little back in return. And it will amaze me if he does actually have the patience to wait until 2027 or whenever it is that they get their first car fully designed by Newey.
Yeah, that's when the piece is going to fall apart. We're going to see what's going to happen with that project. It may be a case of those two are still there in 2026, and it will give an advertisement to the rest of the world of kind of, this is where the project's at and this is what you could be jumping into. It's a lot easier to sell someone on something that's clearly competitive rather than potential or a prospect, as we've seen this year, from the lack of interest in joining what's going to be a full works Audi project, given how far back you're going to have to shuffle back to maybe move forward.
But yeah, we'll just have to see. But it's it seems to be it's kind of the regular scheduled program, and I'm not expecting any miracles in terms of results for them for the rest of the season. Williams are in an interesting position at the moment. That was quite a lot going on this weekend. I mean, things have gone back and forth. I mean, first of all, that crash that Albon had with Behrman in FP1, he was trying to put that on Behrman, and I was like, you lost control. You saw him well in advance, and you lost control well before, like, you got anywhere near him and still hit him. So I don't know what was going on there. And then he crashes again at the start of the race, which it's hard to say if that really counts as his fault, because there was just so little space for him and Tsunoda there, and they banged wheels twice, and then he clipped him because Tsunoda just braked much later. But Albon's form has plummeted ever since Colapinto came in. And I mean, Colapinto is driving very hard, and I'm sure he wants to impress people because he's trying to get a seat for next year. maybe Albon is adjusting partly to that and him being apparently very aggressive, but also having a teammate that isn't just completely useless is quite a new thing for him. He hasn't had that for a few years now. Now people are saying because now Sainz is going in there and he's going to be a great asset for them, even though he'll leave as soon as he can if something better comes up. But I'm just thinking maybe at this point they should consider replacing Albon with Colapinto next year.
Yeah, it's
2005.
2006.
Oh, 2006. Oh,
yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting to see what's kind of happened with Alex and how that's going to then translate into next year as well. You know, like you said, this is the first time where he's had a not rubbish teammate. You know, with all the respect to drivers like Latifi and a Sargent, in a way, you know, they weren't at the high ends that they needed to be and were clearly a league behind what was acceptable kind of in that team. But we did always kind of have those question marks of Alex looked good, you know, upon his return. I was among the first to be really happy that the team that I genuinely support was getting hold of him and to see him kind of rebuild, and it looked like he was doing a decent job. But there was always been question marks over, is he at the level where the car is and that's where he's performing and it just looks better, or is he genuinely going above and beyond what the car is capable of, and actually what Latifi and Sargent are doing is the level it's at. So it was always hard to judge, and it's interesting that Colapinto is the one that's kind of kick-started this weird chain of form for him. You know, I in my mind I thought that Colapinto would be an absolute step up on where Sargent was, but even I, in my wildest dreams, wasn't imagining that he was going to be a point scorer or regularly in and around the point scorers. I thought this would be as good as an opportunity as ever for a reserve driver to kind of blood in and get some racing laps under his belt and maybe be a little bit closer. But yeah, he's driven a lot harder and a lot faster than even I think anticipated he would do. And it was again it was a quiet weekend, but again he was still 12th, 13th, whatever it was, and he's still routinely finishing above wherever Sargent had been all year. So next year's going to be really, really, really interesting to see what level Alex Albon's at, because Carlos Sainz is another level beyond Colapinto, and if Albon gets completely creamed next year, then we need to have a discussion of whether he stays on there. I think in my mind it's almost a little better for Colapinto to be staying in the wings at Williams and waiting for, if Albon does struggle, he can jump in there. If Sainz wants to jump ship, he can jump in there. You know, there's chat about him going to Sauber or going to RB as well. For various reasons, I don't think either makes sense, because in my mind it's not logical. There's no point just being on the grid for the sake of it. You know, you're not going to get a fair opportunity. Really, either of those. Sauber are going to continue to struggle. You're not really going to be able to showcase your potential, and RB just being part of that whole kind of Red Bull process is a bit of a poison chalice, and there are numerous people from the past who can attest to, if you're not part of the Red Bull Junior program and you jump in there, how difficult it can be. I mean, Nick de Vries is the most recent memory, but names like a Bourdais in the past, or even kind of ex-members that jump back in, like a Hartley or something like that, have showcased it's not a nice place to be working in as an outsider. So yeah, I hope he stays on board at Williams and stays as reserve there, because I think opportunities are more likely to come up there at a team where he is well regarded, and we'll get the kind of correct support for him. But yeah, it was, in terms of the race in Mexico, for me, it wasn't Alex's fault. I think you had Yuki on the left trying to squeeze down a gap that was ever diminishing, but then you had, was it Gasly on the right, where there was no other way for Alex to go. So he was sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. But having something like that happen on the same weekend, where he had that needless crash, and where we're starting to ask more questions about him, it's not helpful for his case. But I don't think it's a panic station room yet where we're looking to eject him and put Franco in instead.
Yeah, just that Franco, as well as being quite bold and impressive with how he's driving, he's become a marketing machine almost overnight. I mean, I think he's got basically the whole of Latin America behind him now, because he's got more followers on Instagram than Behrman and Antonelli combined. Like 3 million followers, that is a lot of followers for someone who only just entered Formula One, and before then was kind of a mid-card junior driver.
Yeah.
and we saw that again the reception he got this week, and there is the whole Cola Pinto thing with the drinks, and in the media pen he's quite entertaining because he can be very charming. But then I keep hearing people say that because there was that thing about him snuffing Martin Brundle on the grid walking Cota. And then other people saying, "Oh, he's been completely ignoring all the British journalists and everything." And I'm like, okay, well, if he's going to be that petty about historical tensions, why is he with Williams? Like, why is he part of this British team and everything? If he's gonna be that way, and he obviously cares about the heritage because he wore a helmet commemorating Carlos Reutemann's helmet when he was at Williams. But he's one, and you see, I mean, just looking at the way that him and Lawson were racing, which again was a bit argy-bargy, but just entertaining. It's like this is the thing we need, and this is the funny thing about in Singapore when he just did that huge dive bomb at turn one, and I was like, this is what I want to see is people driving like Kobayashi used to drive and stuff, and Albon was like, what the fuck was that? And he's like, he was nowhere near you. Like, come on. I think they're just this is the thing about. We've seen the resistance to getting Andretti in and other drivers. It's become too cliquey, and it's like, oh, we need to all follow the rules and we do everything safely like this. And then someone comes in and is like, fuck those rules, and I'm just going to do it my way. And yeah, that's something you need. And I mean, Sauber, it's a seat, but that's all I can say. But yeah, I'm thinking maybe they should consider. We'll see how these last few races go. But if Albon doesn't improve, maybe they should consider putting him in instead.
We'll see. I think, Cola Pinto presents that interesting argument where I'm working on a video at the moment where I'm talking about kind of the approaches one makes when they're kind of making their debut and how you drive a car. And it's that difference between one approach where you want to kind of take it more cautiously, kind of build up that confidence and time of the car till you're comfortable, and then you can kind of unleash more of that speed, compared to people who Antonelli-esque just jump in and immediately balls to the wall flat out and just crash, but learn from that and see what happens. And I think, if Cola Pinto had been of the former variety, we wouldn't be discussing him as much. We'd be going, oh yeah, he's taking time in the car, he's building, he's learning. Whereas all of a sudden he's just in and on the pace of Albon and doing these exciting moves like we saw in Singapore and doing a bit of argy-bargy as well. It's genuinely exciting to see, and it's such a good approach because it has people like us talking about him, putting him in connection with seats. Every other kind of journalist and broadcaster is wanting to kind of discuss his potential as well. And it all comes about this kind of really, like you say, Kobayashi positive approach of just wanting to be attacking and almost kind of having fun in the car. I think that's what's quite nice to see, is that it looks like he's genuinely enjoying just being a Formula One driver. And I think that definitely comes into part of that kind of endearing quality that he has to the fans.
Yeah, it's just in general, it's just good because we're in the position where we could have 5 or 6 rookies next year, and with the relatively slow change of driver transfers, that's kind of just something. Yeah, just be good for the sport because there's a lot of people that are just very very mid and very boring at the moment.
Yeah.
But yeah, for once, not being the last team we talk about is Sauber. This one was marginally different from races they normally have in that they didn't spend the entire thing running in last, and they didn't finish last, not because of pace or anything. I mean, Bottas made it into Q2. I think Joe was last because, of course, he's last. He ended up battling a lot with Checo and Lawson. I think he beat both of them at the end because they both pitted, or there was more contact near the end. Bottas at one point, I was like, ooh, he's in the points. And I was like, oh, he hasn't pitted because he ran. Every so often, he'll run like 75% of the race distance on one tyre and then came out near the back. Beyond that, as usual, there's not much to say other than hopefully they get someone interesting in the second seat alongside Hülkenberg.
Yeah, I would say I'm partly a Sauber fan, but more just a fan of teams beginning with S.
Okay.
I generally have nothing Sauber related, but I can't think of anyone who does. It's what is there to say about Sauber? I think, but like I said, there's been those few times where Bottas has been kind of creeping up towards the points, and in a way they've been unlucky that there's not then been, that the right kind of timing for a safety car or something like that that's allowed them to kind of trickle into the points, because that's all they're really banking on at this point in time. Is just a little bit of luck to get them some points, but even at this point in time, it's not going to make a world of difference to their efforts this year. They're already well, 13 odd points behind in Alpine, which they're not going to make up, bar a miraculous crazy race, which we just don't see the likes of that really anymore. So I think in a way they've kind of just accepted we're at the back this year. Maybe if we get a point, that's great and that's newsworthy, but we're moving on to 2025. Again, it's one of those ones where it's been more interesting to talk about what's been happening off track than what's on track. And it's fascinating to me that you've had this, what is essentially a project team in a way that's going to become Audi. And at the beginning of the year, we were all kind of debating who was going to jump in there. And I think a lot of people thought Sainz was a sure kind of fit to that, given his dad's links to Audi in the past as well. And then the fact that as time has gone on, it's just become less and less of an appealing project for anyone to even want to touch, to the point now where we're having discussions of, is it going to be a safe but uninspiring choice of Bottas in the car, or are we going to have, the likes of a Bortoletto or Mick Schumacher coming from nowhere to kind of jump into the seat there? It's wild to me that you can have, a whole project like that and a whole iconic brand like Audi, and even then it's being steered clear of by so many other people that we're kind of, I don't want to call Bortoletto dregs because he's clearly a talented guy and he won F3 and he looks like he could well win F2 this year, but he in reality he should have been nowhere near the conversation for that seat at the beginning of the year, when we consider the names that were being linked to it. So yeah, I don't know what's going on there. I mean, it looks like they're trying to shake stuff up since they've got Bonotto in to try and maybe move things in the right direction, but it's going to be interesting to see who wants to kind of want to touch that and be that big name that tackles it.
I mean, the most interesting thing they did this weekend was that Schwartzman in FP1, he got a 5-place grid penalty for overtaking under yellow flags or something. So, it's a penalty he'll probably never take, because I think he is a contender for that seat on the basis that he's a Ferrari development driver, so he's connected through that. But this is someone that's been out of the loop really for quite a while, so I doubt it would go to him. Mick Schumacher comes up in conversation, but his connections principally are to both Audi and Mercedes that he works with. They keep talking about doing Joe again if they need the money, and also one I really wouldn't mind is Joshua Dirksen, because he like Colapinto is turning into a marketing machine. He's got an avalanche of sponsors from South America. He's been far better than everyone expected in Formula 2. Maybe it's time we got one of the old school people that isn't like from an academy or anything, but just has a ton of sponsors and something like that for fun. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's one positive you can say from F2 this year, is that we've now kind of kickstarted this trend where Behrman and a Colapinto as well have kind of jumped in and immediately kind of impressed. We've seen maybe little flashes of talent in F2, but they've been given a chance and they've taken it. And it's whether, like you say, Dirksen could be interesting to see that, okay, there's a little flash of potential there. Let's see what happens when we put him in a car. Even just a test would be exciting to see. So yeah, maybe Albany will want to buck that trend and just try and pick someone from nowhere. But yeah, I feel like that's just going to rumble on and on and on for a while now until they can finally pick the right person for them.
They have an academy, don't they, Sauber?
So yeah, well, Pourchaire's there, which is very interesting. That he's not even, mad that he's not even been linked at all.
My mind goes blank because I know that I was thinking because Bortoletto they've been talking about, but then he's a McLaren junior. Yeah, Pourchaire's been just ignored, and a lot of people don't like him anyway. But yeah, another F2 champion that's gone. I think there are some other people like Lena Bula and smaller people. No one that's ready for that yet. But
I was always just pointing out that Zane Maloney's been part of that as well. But
yes,
he's off
of course,
to Formula E next year.
Yes, of course.
Which again is a shame because that would have been, having a Barbadian driver in Formula 1 would have been quite interesting for
first Caribbean reasons, or at least first Caribbean driver that races under a Caribbean flag, I guess.
Yeah. It would have been quite an interesting prospect to see, but yeah, that's just not happened, unfortunately. Looks like that part of his journey's over.
Yeah, but again, we cover in every episode. It's the same. We talk about maybe they'll get someone interesting because nothing happens in the races with them, so there's not much to say on that front other than Bottas improved a little bit to get himself to Q2 and everything. And yeah, they just didn't finish last, partly because of RB. Tsunoda now he's basically, after all these years, he's finally getting to sort of audition for Red Bull, and I think he's jeopardized it already at this point. Because last week, when he got undercut by Lawson, and he was like, "How did he get ahead of me?" I knew that he would crash or do something trying to pass him, and he spins on his own and wrecks it. And then he crashed in Q2 on Saturday when he probably could have made it to Q3. That also jeopardized Lawson getting in, and then crashes again at the start. And I was amazed actually when they said he's doing a test in a Red Bull. That's the first time he's driven a Red Bull in his 4th season now with the B team. He's never got to drive one. At this point, I think he's wrecked his chances. And Lawson was just very cantankerous racing. A lot of people on Twitter really don't like him and think he has a serious attitude problem. But, I don't mind that. Again, it makes them more interesting rather than just being so safe and friendly all the time. He too is auditioning for the Red Bull seat. Maybe a bit risky. I don't know. It's hard to say with him only a few races in now after a year out. But at this point, anything is better than Checo.
Very true. Last hat. And you can tell this is a cool mid-2000s hat because it's on sideways.
And when they had
fray as well.
And when they had good liveries as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's Red Bull RB V-Carb, whatever you want to call it. It's such an interesting thing because in many ways Red Bull should have this perfect kind of conveyor belt of talent running through there, and we're at a position now where we're talking about not even having a clue who's going to be in that second car next year, let alone how it's then going to shuffle down to this junior outfit as well. Yeah, Tsunoda's an interesting one. Him getting that long awaited test kind of feels like we haven't got any other options, so let's just put him in the car and see what happens. He may well just blow us away, and that will make the decision for us. But yeah, it's not been a good look for him the last kind of two races as well. Those kind of spins and crashes does not advertise yourself well, especially when there's kind of a documented almost kind of attitude problem that he's had, which I think is why they've maybe wanted to shy away from him there as well. I think especially having that and Max in the same team would almost certainly implode and not work well together. Lawson has done a solid job so far. Again, the last time out in America was a really good race, having come from so far back, with good strategy as well. Again, remembering that he's not really had much time in the car, if any. So again, it's that kind of just jumping straight in and being competitive rather than needing to build up confidence or speed. He's looked decent in that regard. So yeah, I can see the logic behind putting him in the Red Bull, given that he's been, of all the options out there, he's probably the most impressive. Doesn't mean he's the absolute best, but what Red Bull really need is just a dependable pair of hands. I think they've fallen into the trap where every junior that they've got coming through, they want to be the next Vettel, the next Verstappen. And if they're not immediately that kind of mythical level of talent, they want to chuck them out. And actually what they need to be doing is considering, well, you couldn't have two Verstappens in one team. It's just not going to work. You need to be having a conveyor belt, bringing along that more B tier kind of driver, a la like a Perez, who are not necessarily content to be finishing in the runner-up on the podium spots, but will have that talent peak that will put them there and regularly scoring points, but without being that kind of real threat to Max. So again, we said it a little while ago, but yeah, they just generally just don't really know what they're doing or what they want to do. And this weekend, yeah, it wasn't a good advert for Yuki, and Liam was all right. He was running up higher in the points and seemed to drop back quite a lot, which I didn't. I was only watching the highlights this morning, so I didn't quite get a chance to see why he dropped back as far as he did, whether it was a slow pit stop or whatever. But
near the end, there was a collision with Colapinto.
Oh, that would be it there. I didn't
because
pop
of that,
up. Yeah. But yeah, he was still racing with them, beating Checo, so that's at least one thing to kind of beat a drum about.
Yeah, I mean, now at this point, because I've been saying for ages that Tsunoda, because he's the junior and he's been in the B team for a long time, and the idea is you spend a year or two there and then move up to the big team, that they should just put him up because of that. But it's the fact that it feels like he just hasn't learned in the past 3 years. He's still just as cantankerous. He's still crashing at times he really shouldn't be. He got very convincingly beaten by Gasly, even against a failing Ricciardo wasn't particularly impressive. I think the same thing with Lawson. He hasn't. It's been a long time since he's had many standout performances, and if he just keeps doing this for the rest of the season, it's like next year just get rid of him completely. Maybe put Lawson in the Red Bull with Max, and then for VCarb, Hadjar, he's probably going to take the F2 title. For the next one, it's hard to say at that point because, like, Ollie Goethe moved up to F2, but he's driven like shit in it. The others are all F3 or lower because they keep kicking people out of the junior team all the time. Maybe Pato O'Ward if he's desperate for an F1 seat because he was a Red Bull junior for about 2 months in 2017. But what they'll probably end up doing is just bring Ricciardo back again.
Yeah, I mean, the noise I've had is it sounds like they quite like Lindblad. Again, he's only in F3 at the moment, but if we're seeing a precedent of Antonelli jumping from Freca to F2 to Formula One within 2 years, it's not unreasonable for them to, consider what happens if we put an F3 guy in an F1 car. It wouldn't be beyond the realms of possibility, and Red Bull have never had kind of a sense of an exact queue behind them that's been regularly jumped by other people because one person wasn't quite impressive enough or someone else was just a little bit more standout or something like that. So yeah, it's all just a bit of a jumble of what they want to do there. Sonoda's such an interesting one because I struggled to rate him across those kind of first 2 years he had. I think he was too crash prone in the first, and then in order to kind of cut those mistakes out, he lost a bit of his speed at the second. But there were definitely flashes last year and this year as well where he showed potential as a strong runner, but those flashes seem to come too few and far between, I would say. And yeah, in many ways, he should have long been out of that outfit, not because he's necessarily a bad driver, but because that outfit should be there just to assess whether people are going to move up to Red Bull or not. And if they've made the decision that they're not going to, then they should be moved on. I feel like RB has lost a lot of that ruthlessness it had in the early parts of its years, where the likes of Liuzzi, Speed, Buemi, Alguersuari, and plenty of other names, you'd get 2 or 3 years, and if you weren't good enough, that was it. And if you were good enough, you'd get moved up. And it was harsh, and you could borderline unfair, but it worked because that's how you got the big talents and the right kind of names up there. There were more panicked kind of moves like Gasly and Kvyat, who arguably weren't quite ready, but they didn't have a plan B, so that was that fell into place for them, and what happened with those. Same with Albon as well. So yeah, there should be this regular conveyor belt of talent moving forward, and if you're not good enough, you're not deemed right enough, then you need to be dropped. They need to be ruthless with that. I understand why they didn't want to drop Tsunoda or a Gasly, because they are decent midfield runners, but if they're not good enough for that Red Bull seat, then they shouldn't be good enough to stay in what is your quote-unquote junior outfit. And again, we can circle back to a Daniel Ricciardo conversation within that as well. So they need to be if they want to be finding the right people for the team, they need to be moving that talent through at a much better rate. We should have seen Lawson and Ricciardo there this year, because rightly or wrongly, Ricciardo was a candidate for that Red Bull seat. And as soon as that was wrong, then he should have been moved on, and we should be having discussions about a Hadjar or a Lindblad or something like that. So there's lots that needs to be done there, but with the main team kind of imploding enough as it is, I feel like that's going to be quite a low priority to sorting out.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier about Webber's talking with Red Bull about trying to get Piastri in there, that would solve some problems, I suppose, if they just put him in the second Red Bull seat. At that point, if I was Tsunoda, he might just quit on his own, because it's like, well, you're putting all these people in front of me, there's no point being here. And there's like, well, if you're gone, that's great, because then we can just have Lawson and Hadjar, and that solves the point. Or maybe they'll go even more vintage and suddenly they'll bring back Buemi, because I think he's still a simulator and reserve driver for them.
He is still reserve driver there, which is fantastic.
I know. I
10 years on.
I actually love that he's still connected with them after all these years, like 13 years since he last raced, and they still have him on the payroll in some fashion, and occasionally doing testing.
Well, allegedly he's still quite an important cog there, because for what it sounds like, when they've had the weekends there where practice hasn't done the way they've planned. They've plugged Buemi in the simulator for the 12 hours in the evening to try and crank some performance out, and it's attributed to the car turning around. So
Yeah.
it's still a relatively important cog, but yeah, to see a back wheel would be amazing. It would
I
be
mean, maybe they'll
Bedoya-esque
do it.
levels.
Yeah, I was thinking that like a reward, like Bedoya, they could just give him that as for 1 year and see how it goes.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do the tops and the flops for this one. The tops, I'll say Carlos, Lando, and Magnussen, I think.
Mm-hmm. No, I would agree with that as well. Carlos was brilliant throughout all the race. Lando maximised the positions he needed to be in. Leclerc would have been there if he hadn't had that mistake, but kudos for him for not putting it in the walls. And yeah, both the Haas pair were really strong all weekend, but Magnus in particular, I think they said it was his highest finish since 2022 or something like that. So yeah, great drives all round for those three.
Yeah. For flops, a bit of a Red Bull fest. I'd say Max, Checo, and Yuki.
Yeah, I think you could put Oscar in there. I think he disappointed with qualifying, and like we said, he didn't really make the progress he should have had on race day. Sergio was just nowhere and too error prone. You know, we've seen poor performances recently, but this was almost kind of another step beyond that, where he kind of almost cracked under that hometown pressure. You could, yeah, and I think you can argue putting Max into that position as well, if only by the fact that he was too aggressive when he didn't need to be in it, and that's what's cost him a big chunk of points this weekend is his decision making at that time rather than just letting Lando by.
Yeah. So yeah, overall, not a bad race in the end. I mean, I was expecting a pretty dull one, but we had a bit of drama and controversy before the race and actually in the beginning of the race.
Yeah.
And then Sao Paulo next weekend. That'll be a fun one again. I imagine it's always a good race, but I imagine it'll be a very controversial one for the championship. I can picture that too.
That first kind of turn into those center S's, it always kind of breeds room for deep dives and kind of mad bombing up the inside. So I can absolutely see something happening there, especially between those two candidates as well. If one's defending from the other, you know, that kind of breeds all sorts of collisions over the years. So I would be very surprised if we didn't have something like that happen again this year. I mean, we saw what happened when Max and Lewis battled there in 2021. We could have more kind of conversations along that line.
Yeah, this is a circuit where Max has quite an extensive rap sheet. So I can't picture it going well for him. Also, another one for me, I'll have to. It's a national anthem I'll actually have to practice because it's quite knotty, that one. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. We're on YouTube and Spotify, and you can find us on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time. Is it gone?
It's gone. Please, fam, I want to get my hat. I don't want to. I've committed to this bit all the way through. I'm not going to falter just on Aston Martin. Wait.
I'm sat here. I'm trying to remember like previous teams. I get them all mixed up. It was Racing Point, Force India, Spiker, and yeah, MF1, and then Jordan. Yeah. I always get those mixed up in my head. This is taking him a while.